Hello everyone. Today we're here in Greenwich with Rachel Quine. I'm going to let you talk about your role as well because I think it's a bit of a mouthful, your job title, but actually it's the Royal Borough of Greenwich where we are today. And I'm going to ask you, first about your role and then a bit about your background and how you got into it.
Sure. So at Royal Borough of Greenwich, I'm the Restorative Approaches and Anti-Bullying Coordinator. So it is a little bit of a mouthful.
Mm-hmm.
And it's my role to provide training and support to schools and teams and services across the borough with using and implementing restorative approaches. And I mean, it's quite interesting that I am the Restorative Approaches Coordinator, not the Restorative Justice Coordinator, and I think it's the kind of recognition that conflict and harm and damage to relationships happen outside of just crime and victims and offenders. So it's very much about looking at the broader restorative practice and, like I said, providing training and support to people to do that, to make it happen within Greenwich.
I think you're right. I think the restorative justice title refers very much to those processes that go in parallel with restorative criminal justice processes, and that's where you have the term justice there to associate it. I suppose that it was intentional. You want to make it look justice as well, in that sense that it is criminal justice and restorative justice, and they go in parallel, but justice nevertheless. Whereas in your case, restorative approaches is more wide encompassing. You include things like, in your role, I suppose you see anything from disputes in schools to disputes between neighbours, and all sorts of things that are not necessarily something that you would bring to justice.
Yes, absolutely. I do a lot of work with schools, and I think sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes people get a bit put off by that justice word. They kind of think, well, we don't need restorative justice because this is just something, that's happening, in a playground or in a community. So that's not us, because it kind of, for some people, not all the time, but some people, it has quite clear connotations, doesn't it, with something very formal and the justice system.
Becoming too serious as well,
Yeah, and I suppose it's just that recognition that it is a process that can be applied in lots of situations, and that's sometimes easier to kind of help people to connect with it. But ultimately, it's kind of all the same thing, but there's the justice approaches practice kind of
You know what's funny, because when we talk about restorative justice, I think that some people might have an idea of what it is. When you talk about restorative approaches, which includes restorative justice, I think a lot of people are not going to be quite sure what it is. I was having this conversation just yesterday with another person in the restorative justice world, and I was saying, like, how do you explain restorative justice or restorative approaches in one sentence? Because I struggle to explain it to my relatives and friends. What it is that I do. So how would you put it? How would you say? If you're trying to sell, in a way, restorative approaches to your customers, again, maybe not the best word, but in this case, we'll use it. How do you explain it? What do you say? Why don't we try restorative approaches? And then you have to say restorative approaches are.
It's a tough one. And I think, like you, I've struggled for many years. And how do you describe what you do in a short, kind of concise way? I suppose I would say that restorative approaches is an approach to conflict and harm that looks at enabling communication and trying to put things right again. Okay. So I think it's very simplest form. It is about trying to, enable people to communicate about what's gone wrong.
Well, I think that's a very good description, actually, because I think it is, in essence, it's trying to get people to communicate. You give them the tools, and you give them the setting, and you give them the opportunity to do so. Because a lot of the time, I imagine that when you have conflicts, let's say between two neighbours that have lived door to door for 50 years, and then something happens, they may not be equipped to discuss that. They might just think, "No, this person did this to me." The other person might even know that something happened, but then notices that there's a distance now between them. And what you do with restorative approaches is you recognize the fact that there is a conflict, obviously, and then you talk to them. You give them you set the stage for them to meet in an organized way to discuss things, a structured way that you go to discuss the issue that they may not have recognized at that point.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very good description. I might use it from now on.
I think it's a little bit more than a sentence, but yeah. Yeah. So.
What about your background? How do you get to this?
Well, about 10 years ago, I started working for victim support on a project which was a collaboration with the youth offending team in the area. And it was about trying to provide education, going into schools to talk about crime and the effects of crime. And as part of that, very early on into that role, I actually received training in restorative justice. It was then, and it was, an incredible experience, and it really kind of resonated with me in that training. And I thought, it just makes so much sense, and it's really simple, and it's really important. And actually, it became quite a sort of part of my role to be using restorative justice as well, and perhaps talking about that in schools. And then after about a year and a half of doing that, I actually got a role within the Youth Offending Service as a kind of victim restorative justice worker. So that involved, speaking to victims and working with young people and trying to facilitate restorative communication.
So were you working as a practitioner at that point?
Yeah, so I became a practitioner. And since then, for about, pretty much the last 8 years, I've worked in different youth offending services in that role. So very much in the criminal justice system, but, every day talking to victims, talking to young people, trying to see if it's going to work to bring them together or what they need, and supporting them through that process. And, so it's been, I kind of consider myself to be really fortunate, actually, because I came, I found out about restorative justice at the very beginning of my career, and it absolutely has shaped what I've done since.
Do you think that in your time as a practitioner, through the different processes that you have led, you have achieved, you have helped people become happy again, perhaps overcome the traumas? Do you think that you have had a positive impact in those people that you have worked with?
Yeah, I would really hope so. And I think what I've always done as a practitioner is at the end of sort of a restorative meeting, or maybe an indirect process like exchange of information or letter or shuttle mediation, is to ask for feedback and send feedback forms to people. Now obviously for lots of reasons people don't always want to fill them in, and that's fine, but from that it's really interesting to find out what people say about the impact that it's had on them. And in that time, I suppose I've worked from very minor things like somebody stealing something from Tesco's and going to talk to the manager, through to really serious cases, like burglary and manslaughter. And I think, it really, restorative processes really have the process to help, the potential to help people to kind of move on, or just shift things for people. Maybe it's about providing healing, or maybe it's just about closure, or just a new understanding. And so hopefully that's happened.
It is very interesting that you're talking about serious cases, because that is not a debate that is settled in the community. I think a lot of people think that restorative justice is okay for petty crime, ruin from Tesco's or something like that. But when you get into the serious stuff, manslaughter, sexual abuse, and rape and things like that, some people think, I'm not too sure that restorative justice is okay. And I think a lot of people as well see it as a way to give the offender the benefit of a second chance without them deserving it. So a lot of people see restorative justice, specifically restorative justice, as giving a person that has done something wrong a second chance. But what is your experience? Do you think that restorative justice works as well in serious cases?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things in response to that, really. I think from my experience of speaking to a lot of victims, that really there's a bit of a kind of almost like a cost-benefit analysis that victims do about actually what am I going to have to put into this process and what am I going to get out of it. So sometimes for quite minor things, if it hasn't really had an impact on them, they might feel I don't need to do this. It's not really important for me, and I don't really want to give up my time, and that's completely fine. Yeah. Whereas perhaps if it is something more serious, it's having more of an impact on them and on their well-being, and actually going through that process could have a much greater benefit for them. So they may be more interested or willing to take part.
So what you're saying is actually, the more serious the case, perhaps the more relevant restorative justice becomes.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, obviously, you have to appreciate that, this offence doesn't equal that reaction, because everyone's different, and something very minor can have a huge impact on somebody depending on what else is going on. But I think people do have to sort out from a victim perspective, what is this going to do for me, and do I feel like that's worth it, and that I want to do that. I think the second point is that I think it's really, really important to kind of shy away from that kind of sort of categorisation. So this type of offence, it should never be considered, because what you're doing there is taking the kind of decisions and the power away from victims or offenders, the people involved. And to say that actually categorically we shouldn't ever do restorative justice in a murder case, that is, you taking that decision away from somebody. I mean, obviously it has to be assessed as safe and appropriate for victims, and we wouldn't want anyone to be put at any risk of further harm or re-victimisation, and that's really important. But to kind of say, right, we won't ever consider it in that case, actually that becomes about you and your concerns or your need to put a boundary on it, rather than being about the people in that situation. And that's the really key thing about restorative practice, is it gives some of that back over, and that's, to the people in that as a victim.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say that runs counter the philosophy of restorative justice. What you do is you empower victims and offenders to an extent as well to have control of the process and go as far as they want to go, or not go at all. Yeah, if that be the case.
Absolutely. And the final thing to that really is that I think there's still quite a lot of misunderstanding, because for a lot of cases, I mean, particularly in the youth justice system at the moment, and I think it's probably true for the adult system, that so much of restorative practice happens afterwards, and perhaps a long time afterwards, or there's already been a sentence that's happened, so they're already sentenced post-conviction. Yeah. I mean, there are some obviously pre-conviction or pre-sentence, that's the word, thank you, pilots, and there is that happening. But so actually it's, it's not, it's often alongside, because what you find is that if there's a crime committed or some kind of harm that happens, we have a system to, a consequence or a punishment system, however you want to look at it. But often what needs to happen is the relationships need to be kind of looked at and repaired. So I think, it's very rarely that kind of offenders are taking part as a second chance, or as a, as opposed to a sentence, particularly for serious offences.
Restorative justice is not an alternative. It tends to go in parallel with the criminal justice processes.
I mean, it could be maybe, but at the moment it very much exists as in parallel. So it's that actually, if you're the victim of a very serious offence and that offender is locked up or put in prison, that might be, you might be really happy with that, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's sorted.
There might be an element of reassurance, the fact that the person that harmed you is cannot reach you anymore. Yeah. But why do you think? I have an idea as well. I have an impression, but I want to know, why do you think that happens? Why do you think that restorative justice in that context is typically applied after a sentence has been passed?
I think it's just because of the system that we have. I mean, and I think. Restorative justice is emerging, and it's growing, and it's becoming more part of the mainstream. But I think we're still a really long way off, what might happen in other countries or communities, or may have happened a long time ago, where it's a completely different system for deciding on kind of sentence. There's also a debate about whether we should go back to that, and I think it's just, that's the system that we're in. Maybe I don't think that many people are arguing that there shouldn't be serious, significant sentences for serious crime, but it's the recognition that doesn't really do anything for the people, and for the people in that situation and what they individually need. And that's why restorative process can, is an opportunity to explore that and actually empower them, both sides perhaps, to do what they need to do.
I think you're right. I mean, my impression is that you have the criminal justice system, the standard system, for offenders to pay their dues with society. But obviously, society is an abstract idea, and what you have for restorative justice is there a way of, I mean, pain is not the right word, but the offender settling with what he or she may have done to the victim. But because our system, the standard one, is the one where society as a whole takes priority. What you're using is the criminal system to first settle that big debt, the traditional justice, and then only after. What you're saying essentially is that the criminal justice system is more important, and that's why it takes place first, because it shouldn't be affected by restorative justice.
I'm not sure that I'm saying that it is more important or it shouldn't. I'm just saying I suppose that's the reality that we're with. That at the moment, the way restorative practice is developing is alongside, and I think what's quite interesting about perhaps restorative practice within schools rather than the criminal justice system is that they are a bit more of an identifiable community, and they are able to kind of put in processes at a whole range of different levels, and actually that can change, how a society or a community is, how they respond.
I'm going to ask you about that. Why do you think that restorative justice is an important element that should be part of school?
Yeah, well, I think, really, sort of conflict and harm is quite inevitable. It happens wherever there's a group of people, in any sense of that, whether it's a school or community or society. But actually, if we think about it, we spend very little time sort of teaching our children and young people how to deal with it. We're not equipping them to deal with the conflicts that are inevitably going to happen in their lives. And also because in schools you're kind of community of relationships as well, and you see each other every day. And so it's an opportunity to help to develop the skills, I think, that young people and children have into dealing with these things that are ultimately going to be part of their life, whether it's about communication or empathy or listening, and that sense of it being fair, and it's a process for allowing them to be reintegrated and be part of that. So I think it's really important that it happens for children and young people.
So you would almost say that restorative justice in schools is important because it helps them cope with conflicts that may arise in that environment, but it stays with them for the rest of their life.
Yeah, absolutely.
It helps them develop the skills that will allow them in future when they grow into adults to.
And I think, I was asked by school to facilitate a meeting between two 15-year-old boys where there'd been a fight, and there was an allegation that one of them had a knife, and that young person was excluded, and then after a period of time he was allowed back into school. So the situation, we had two people, major incident, they were now in the same community, they were going to run into each other. So they wanted to do a restorative meeting to kind of, to try and support the fact that they were both going to be in this school environment. And the meeting was very tense. It wasn't, there wasn't hand shaking and everything okay again, but we went through it, there was an agreement, and about a month later I went back to sort of see how things were going and also to get some feedback from them. And both of them at the end of it, the question was, have you learned something? And they both said they had, and one of them said that you don't have to deal with conflict in this way, that there are other ways of dealing with it. And I just think that's so invaluable for a 15-year-old boy to learn that you don't have to have another fight or do this or do that. There's another way that you can kind of sort it. Now, they didn't apologise and they weren't friends. They'll probably never be friends. But, that's some of the impacts of restorative practice that I think so often gets forgotten because it's very difficult to measure or to kind of to count and to sort of, show, but it's so important that you are, and as a facilitator, you're holding the space, you're providing the structure, and people are, because of the ground rules and how things are, people are showing respect and listening to each other. That might be the only time that happens for people in their lives because of, the communication.
Well, that's right, and also because I think in this society, in our society, it looks like we're very much individuals, and we have to be on top of each other, and in a way we learn to be adversarial in the sense that you cannot tolerate if you're a male, for example, you cannot tolerate another person to cause an offense to you. It may not be anything; it may just be calling you names or something like that. But that's a mortal crime for you because it affects your self-esteem, things like that. And we're not educated to understand, that, well, first thing is it may not be important, it may not be relevant anyway. The second thing, if it's a problem, then, perhaps the way to do it is rather than going and smacking that person, it's just having a conversation and saying, like, why do you say that? And that has had that effect on me.
Being able to kind of talk it out and work out a way forward.
So we're sort of programmed to sort of work our way towards a bigger conflict, So instead of getting a small conflict and dealing with it, we're sort of programmed to make it even bigger.
And I suppose that's the other thing about schools is whereas perhaps in the criminal justice system you might have two people who don't really know each other and they may never see each other again, and there are obviously added risks towards that. In school you've got people who are going to see each other every day, and maybe a conflict like in year 7, first year of secondary school, if you're not resolving that can still be impacting on something that's happening 4 years later. So it's about giving different opportunities rather than making it a bigger and bigger conflict, to actually be able to kind of deal with it in that way. And I suppose, that's a lot of the support and training that we provide to schools is about, enabling and sort of training staff to understand the processes so that they can, it can become part of everything that they do within the school.
And the important thing about schools as well is that obviously children tend to have parents.
Yes.
And then the good news, reverberate through family as well. It sort of gives many families the first contact with the concept of restorative justice. So they may not have been victims at that point, and they may not know anyone who may have been. But when they become, if they do, or if someone in their circle becomes a victim at some point, or even an offender, to be honest, they know that option is there and they know how it works.
Yeah, but I suppose also there's lots of conflict and harm within families and sometimes between families and schools as well. And so it's, I suppose, they'll have an awareness of restorative justice, but it's maybe also like allowing them or enabling them to know about different ways for handling sort of harm as well, And I think sometimes schools really need to involve and have to involve parents in those restorative meetings because the relationship breakdown stems as far as them, or it might be between the schools and the parents. So, and I think, what's quite positive about kind of my role being sort of based within the local authority is that, I work across a lot of teams. So yes, I do work with schools, but also increasingly, with youth offending service and other teams within the local authority or partners. And it's about kind of growing the awareness of the restorative approach and its impact, so that actually perhaps it might be that the children are in a primary school, but the parents might be involved in offending, or they might be involved with children's services, and it's about kind of making those links really. I suppose restorative practice is a lot about relationships, repairing relationships, but also about building relationships. So it's about kind of making that network and not seeing, right, this school's restorative approach is just over here and that has no impact with what our youth offending service are doing or what our social workers are doing, or the wider.
That's a very interesting concept and a very interesting idea. We were talking about this before, where you perhaps have as an element of your role to network, and that is work as well, obviously. It's just not you going around having coffees with people. It's about making sure that, because you may have potential clients for restorative justice processes coming from different sections. So you may have people from schools, children or teachers or families, but you may also have people who have housing problems, and those may come from a different section, a different part of your area of influence. And you need to remind those people that you work with that if they've encountered a situation where they think the restorative justice could help, they should be able to refer it to you or to your team and things like that, so that everyone that needs it has access to restorative justice.
And even within Greenwich as well, even the adult social care have done, they're involved in a pilot using family group conferencing for safeguarding issues within adults, and so they're sort of using restorative processes and restorative meetings as well. So it's kind of expanding out really. I mean, obviously we've got a really well-established kind of restorative practice and restorative justice worker within the youth offending service, but it is, you know, as a local authority, we're kind of looking at how we might be able to sort of, you know, become more restorative as a whole of kind of children's services. But like you said, yeah, we run the practitioner network meetings, so they're about 3 or 4 times a year, and it's an opportunity for kind of anyone within the borough and also other people, you know, who've been involved in our training and want to still be involved, to kind of come together and to perhaps talk about restorative practice that they're doing, or perhaps challenges with cases, to kind of get a little bit of peer support and ideas, but also to look at perhaps new research or new ideas that are coming through. So to really kind of focus on restorative practice and development. And I think it's really important that we have those networks that are as wide as possible, really, that we don't say this is just our school's network and this is just our, you know, criminal justice network. It's about saying we're all working within Greenwich, so, you know, we're all trying to work restoratively, and, you know, let's build those relationships between ourselves and let's make those links, really.
That's great. Also, apart from the fact that you, as a unit, work within the borough, you have people who may have children, and then, you know, they have the possibility of conflict in the school. Then you have people who have neighbours. You have the possibility of conflicts between neighbours and things like that. So it's one same family unit may have different entry points, if you like, to your service, because they go to shops, they live somewhere, they have children, they do all those things. I'm going to ask you about the training that you provide here in Greenwich. I'm going to then later ask you about some of the things that are slightly more tricky. But tell me about the training that you do here, because you said that it's you have a level 5 qualification. That's what you do here.
Yeah, so we run a sort of 4-day restorative approaches facilitator training, which sort of equips people to be able to begin to be a facilitator. Is
that the internal service only for people working for the council or for?
No, not at all. I mean, we run it. It's within the borough, but it's open to
anyone who might be interested in restorative justice.
Yeah, and what's really great about it is often we do have a bit of a mix. So we'll have primary school and secondary school, but we might also have social workers or YOS team, or, you know, so it's a bit of a mixture, which I think is really good, again, for building those relationships and an understanding of different people's roles. And so we run that as a 4-day course, but we also have a level 5 accreditation option, which is sort of one of only a handful of courses that have achieved the Restorative Justice Council's accreditation sort of approval. So that's a course that's credit rated by the University of Greenwich, as well as the Restorative Justice Council. And after the initial training, participants have kind of 12 months to put together a portfolio. And really, that whole course is based around the theory, the practice, and the implementation or the embedding of restorative practice. I personally think, you know, the way the course is designed, that really you need to have those three. You know, you can have some fantastic courses that focus just on the practice, but if you don't know the theory, then you don't know what to do when things go a little bit wrong. You don't know why you might do something a particular way. And then also, you know, you can have courses that look at theory and practice, but then nobody does anything afterwards because they haven't thought about how to take it to the next level or how to make it work in their setting. So through the course of that 12 months, students are putting together a portfolio which is including some essays to sort of focus you onto the theory. It's looking at case studies and an observation for the practice, and then it's also kind of about sort of keeping a record of all your activities that you do to try and promote restorative practice. So
it's pretty much having continuous professional development embedded in the course.
And I think it's a really holistic approach. I mean, although I think some of the students perhaps regret it when they've got to try and send in their essay and they kind of haven't done their reading, but actually I think a lot of people do have an interest in finding out more, but you know, because of pressures of the job and time, maybe you don't actually have the time to sit down and read it, but yet if you're doing it for an essay, then you have to. So I think it it really sort of enables people to develop kind of all round, really, to understand why they might be doing something, you know, to be looking at the National Occupational Standards and the practice, but then also to be thinking about how do I promote it in my setting. So, and actually the practitioner network meetings are part of that course. So if you're doing the level 5 accreditation, you have to attend 3. And that's because I think reflection is a really, really important part of being a restorative practitioner. I think, we always need to reflect on what we've done, how did it go, how could it be better, what could we learn, what have other people done or thought, how could we learn from that?
And I think that's a very important, not because this is for the Restorative Forum, by the way, but I think generally it's important that as a community we learn to share what works and also what doesn't. Because I think that what works, it's perhaps easier, but what doesn't work implies in a way that you have tried something that didn't work well. And but I think that is life, isn't it? You live, you have experiences, some go well, some don't go well. And as a community of practice, we should be able to share those so that others don't stumble on the same.
Absolutely. And I think because, every sort of restorative meeting or process is really individual, because it's so much about the people who are taking part, So I think there's always something that you can learn. You'll never get to a point where you'll know everything, actually.
So we're talking about it's not a sausage factory. They're not all going to be the same.
Exactly, it's all different. So I think that's why it's quite good to have people from different backgrounds as well, because people in school staff might actually be doing restorative meetings every single day, whereas staff in probation or criminal justice system might take them, might do one case a year perhaps. So there's different skills that are developing there, and obviously different levels of seriousness and other factors, different risks. But to be able to share what you could learn, or to do that, I think it's really important. So that's why it's part of our course, really.
One other question about your qualification, because you said that it's credit rated by the University of Greenwich.
Yes. Yeah.
Does that mean that those credits count towards another qualification? So if you're studying law, you can include those as part of your qualification.
Yeah, so it's 60 credits at level 5, and that they can be put towards other courses. So level 5 is the equivalent of sort of first year of degree, and they can be used towards other courses with the University of Greenwich, but also with other universities as well.
That's great to know.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go now into the slightly more, how would I call it, questions about the system and about what you have here. Things like, why do you think that the borough or a PCC, for example, looking at their budget, should think, I'm going to put some money in restorative justice? Why do you think that those with responsibility over budgeting and over the provision of services should consider restorative justice something they should provide to their clients or their citizens? Yeah,
that's a really good question. I mean, personally, I think that they should invest it because it's, a process that can help people, of both sides of conflict and harm, people who've caused it and people who've been harmed, to move on in a better way with more understanding and to provide some closure. So it's almost like it's something that can help people. But to take a more cynical view, I suppose, if we're talking about budgets, I mean, it's also, because it helps people to have closure or to move on, to deal with things that they haven't been able to deal with before, perhaps. What it can do is to stop just a continual reoccurrence of things happening. So if you don't, if a minor thing happens in a school, for example, and you don't resolve that and it becomes a bigger and bigger issue, then somebody's excluded, and then maybe the borough has to pay for alternative provision for somebody or whatever. And so because it has the ability to kind of change things in conflict and harm or reoffending or neighbour disputes, then actually it can lead to spending less money on those cases, because it stopped happening or things have shifted. So actually it can provide cost savings if you want to be really cynical about it. I mean, that's not why I think they should do it, but if we're playing that game.
Let's not use the word cynical. No, but the reason why I'm asking you is because, a lot of us within the community will say, well, that's an obvious question. It provides a social benefit. It has a very positive impact on the people involved. That's very obvious to us.
Yeah.
But if you are trying to sell the idea of restorative justice, which is not free, by the way, to someone who has to make decisions about budgets, how much money should go into the budget for education or health or social services and things like that, they need to know that yes, it's very good that it has a positive impact on people, but I'm not going to be measured or judged by that, by those standards. It's very difficult to measure happiness or how improved the life of a person has become.
But I guess, what is it that costs money? It's when there is relationship breakdown or things go wrong. Okay, so, families break down, people have to be accommodated, things break down with the school, people have to be educated elsewhere, somebody commits a crime, there's relationship breakdown there. So that's often, is what causes...
You have simple cases like conflict between neighbours, and then you have the administrative costs of constant calls to the local authority, for example, or the landlord, and you have interventions by the police quite regularly as well because of minor things. So that's what I was wanting to get at, because I think that you're completely right. Cynical to a point, but it is reality, isn't it? A lot of people who are looking at budgets need to realize that there are cost savings in restorative justice. You spend some money to save more money.
Exactly, yeah. And it's the same with time. Sometimes it does take more time, absolutely, but it's kind of like time now to save time later. So if you sort this out properly now, like in a school situation, then you could be saving hours of time through the next 5 years of school, and it's the same for many things. So, yeah.
Well, I think that's a fantastic answer. I think that it's very well condensed and very clear. So I'm not going to try to improve it because I think they cannot be improved. I think that's pretty much it. I think that you have a lot of interesting stuff to talk about here with Greenwich. We talked about before these things. If you go into those meetings that you have every 2 months, and you get any learnings that you want to share with other practitioners, the Restorative Forum is there for you as well. And obviously encourage all of your members and friends and colleagues to join as well.
As you perhaps have found, that often when people have been trained and become involved, they become very enthusiastic about restorative practice because they can really see the benefits in their worlds, in their work, in their lives. So I think people are really keen to, they don't have to come to these meetings, but people do, because I think there is a genuine interest in it. And so therefore I think, it's good to encourage them to take part in more sharing and learning with other practitioners.
And you promised that you would invite me to the next one.
Okay, sure.
Okay, that's great. Okay. Well, Rachel, thank you very much for your time. I think, I tell you what, I think that we have got a few things quite clear, particularly the benefits of restorative justice to the parties involved, but also, why local authorities or police and crime commissioners should consider restorative justice an element in their strategies. It does save money. I think that it has been estimated that for every £1 invested, it gets 8 back, which is not to be sniffed at. Well, Rachel, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the Royal Borough of Greenwich.
Yes, thanks.